Hello, everyone. It's an honor to be here today, standing on this red dot. And hopefully, together, we can defy this misconception of practicality. But before we begin, let's actually define what practical means. So, according to Oxford dictionaries, practical refers to something that is likely to succeed or be effective in real circumstances, or a person who is sensible and realistic in their approach to a situation or problem. Unfortunately, the word practical is often used in the wrong context today. Practicality tends to be incredibly useful when we use it for our daily tasks, but it can be detrimental when the same mentality is used to set our personal goals. Growing up, a lot of us wanted to be astronauts, and others wanted to be actors in mainstream media. But the misconception of practicality convinced us that we should be more feasible about our goals, and rather choose the ones that are likely to succeed or be effective in real circumstances. Society makes our youth believe that they should go into an undergraduate program right after high school, or find a job and go into a master's program right after their undergraduate degree. In fact, I've got so many friends who take an incredible amount of pressure on themselves if they're unable to find a position right after their undergraduate degree. I myself have been victim to the misconception of practicality. Growing up, I had a deep interest in the world of finance and entrepreneurship, but the misconception of practicality convinced me that being an Albertan, it was most feasible for me to get a chemical engineering degree and contribute to the oil industry around me. I was 17 when I had my first internship at Shell, which was any engineering student's dream. However, with time, I realized that I wanted to explore avenues that were not so feasible based on my background and experience. When I started to drop the misconception of practicality, everything changed. For example, last summer I rejected an offer from a world-leading energy company to be able to work on Canada's largest trading floor. And even more, I launched my own business with my co-founder, and we've shipped product all across North America and been featured on Canada's major media outlets. From my experience, I've learned that practice, launching, and exploring is the best way to learn. For example, my business taught me how to hire people, negotiate contracts, work with suppliers, and be customer-centric. Practicality is a skill that is developed through experience and enables you to, as Nike says, just do it. It is an essential element to climb every step in your long ladder. So the message I want to get across to you today is, be practical in your actions, not your goals. Use practicality to bring feasibility to your tasks, not your ambitions. A lot of us are fearful of launching into exploring something that our current job or environment cannot satisfy because there remains a threat of losing that stable and sustainable life that we currently have. It is not sensible to ditch what we have in the hopes of achieving something more. You may be unconvinced to make that leap of faith. So let's take a quantitative and practical approach to the concept of taking risk, you defying this misconception of practicality, and pursuing your dreams. I'd like you all to meet my friend. His name is Joe. Now, Joe's 22 years old, and he just graduated from his undergraduate degree. And yes, Joe's an emoji because none of my friends agreed to pose as Joe. Now, Joe's a pretty frugal guy, and when it comes to his spending habits, he's very disciplined. And he expects that annually, for the rest of his life, he's going to spend $40,000 in terms of his expenses. And this could include things like his student debt, his living expenses. But Joe's basically just trying to help us out in our financial analysis that we'll be conducting around his life. Now, Joe's always been passionate about the world of business. He's always wanted to be an entrepreneur. But he's afraid about his chances of success in this world. And Joe often wonders, what is the cost of him taking out 5 years of his life to try and establish that business of his dreams? So let's help out Joe. Let's quantify the monetary cost and profit of being non-practical about Joe's goals, because money is the most feasible commodity we have today. We'll be looking at 4 scenarios and comparing Joe's net worth at 65, or his bank account at 65, in today's dollars, to be able to compare these different ways of going about Joe's life. So what are the 4 ways of going about Joe's life? Well, in the first way, Joe is the most practical, as our society defines it, about his goals. And he goes into a high-end corporate job right after his undergraduate degree. In the second case, Joe is pretty comfortable with the concept of taking risk. So he takes out 5 years after his life to try and establish that business of his dreams. But unfortunately, the business fails. And because he's got to be able to sustain his expenses, he has to go back and find a high-end corporate job. In the third case, Joe tries to establish that lifestyle business of his dreams. So this could be that coffee shop or that yoga studio. And in the fourth case, Joe goes for an all-or-nothing approach, where he tries to innovate a disruptive technology. Some of the best value investors in the world today make some assumptions about a company's cash flows to be able to forecast the cash flows into the future, to be able to find the company's value today. And similarly, we'll be making a set of assumptions about each one of these paths and forecast the cash flows into Joe's life to be able to find the monetary worth today of each of these different ways of going about Joe's life. I want to walk you through this financial analysis because I want to prove to you with numbers that exploration into what may seem non-feasible is in fact worth it. Because we hear messages like, pursue your passion and follow your heart, but then we look around us and we say, that's not practical. So let's talk about our first case. As part of the first case, Joe is the most practical about his ambitions. He says, you know what, I probably won't be able to succeed in the world of business, so I might as well find a high-end corporate job right after my undergrad degree. So let's assume that at 22, Joe finds a $50,000 job. And because Joe is so hardworking, he's able to grow that compensation within the corporate at 5% annually. And this growth could come in the form of him getting some promotions and doing well in his job. So using these assumptions, if we forecast Joe's cash flow into the future, this is the cash flow diagram that we come up with. As you can see, by the time Joe's 22, he starts making $50,000. And because he's able to grow that compensation by 5% annually, by the time he's 65, that compensation turns into roughly $400,000, which is a pretty high-end corporate job. The orange bars on this graph show you Joe's net savings after he pays for his taxes and his expenses. But the takeaway from this graph is that by the time Joe's 65, he'll have $1.4 million in the bank, which is amazing that he can become a millionaire by just working a job throughout his life. But let's talk about our next case. As part of case 2, let's assume that Joe is more comfortable with the concept of taking risk. So let's assume he takes out 5 years of his life after his undergrad degree to try and establish that business of his dreams. And to be able to sustain his expenses during that time, he takes out a $200,000 loan. And unfortunately, the business fails to generate enough cash flows for Joe. So he fails in the world of business. He calls it quits, and he has to find a high-end corporate job at the end of the 5 years to be able to sustain his lifestyle. So let's assume that he finds a corporate job at 27, that starts paying him $50,000. And again, because Joe's such a hardworking individual, he's able to grow that compensation by 5% annually. So now, using these assumptions, let's forecast Joe's cash flow into the future. And we see this is what it looks like. As you can see, he's only able to start saving by the time he's 42 because he's got to pay back that $200,000 loan that he took out to be able to sustain his lifestyle during the 5 years of exploration. And because his career is shorter in this case, he doesn't really reach that $400,000 mark in terms of his compensation by 65. So by the time Joe's 65, he'll have $900,000 in the bank, which you may say is pretty sad. And Akash, you're not doing a good job of explaining to us as to why we should be exploring. But hang on. Let's talk about a third case. So in this case, let's assume Joe takes out 5 years after his undergrad degree, and again, a $200,000 loan to try and establish that lifestyle business of his dreams. So this could be that coffee shop or that yoga studio. And at the end of the 5 years, he succeeds. Let's assume that the business starts generating for Joe $100,000 by the time he's 27. And Joe set up the business in a way that it's self-running, and he's got managers in place. So he can focus his time and effort on growing his business's earnings. And so let's assume that every year he's able to grow his company's earnings by 5%. And this could come in the form of him opening more branches of his coffee shop or reaching more e-commerce channels. So this is what his cash flow looks like in the third case. This time, he's only able to start saving by the time he's 32 because, again, he's got to pay back that $200,000 loan that he took out. But what we calculate in this case is that by the time Joe's 65, his savings actually equal $2.8 million. So now you start seeing the benefit of exploration. And Joe certainly does, as he's got a nice tan on his face, he's got a big smile, and he's got nice shades as he's probably chilling in the Bahamas. But if you think that's good, let's talk about our last case. As part of case 4, Joe decides to go for an all-or-nothing approach. So let's assume again that he takes out 5 years after his undergrad degree and a $200,000 loan to try and disrupt an innovative technology. And he succeeds. He launches a Kickstarter campaign, and a market leader in the industry wants to buy out his technology because they see value in it. So let's assume that Joe gets a $5 million check at the age of 27 to be able to buy out his technology. And with the large amount of money that's sitting in Joe's bank, he just decides to make 5% of whatever is left in his bank account for the rest of his life. And again, this 5% could come in the form of real estate investments or stock investments. But using these set of assumptions, if we forecast Joe's cash flow into the future, this is what we come up with. Obviously, he gets a pretty big paycheck at 27, and he gets taxed heavily on it. Then he just decides to make 5% on that savings for the rest of his life. And what we calculate in this case is that Joe's savings by the time he's 65 will actually equal $8 million. So now, Joe's got an even better tan, he's got nicer shades, and he's got a bigger smile as he's chilling in the Bahamas. So in summary, we met our friend Joe. Joe's a 22-year-old who just graduated from his university degree. And Joe had 4 different ways of potentially going about his life. In the first way, Joe was the most practical about his goals, and he went into a high-end corporate job right after his undergraduate degree and worked there till he was 65. And in that case, he saved up $1.4 million by the time he was 65. In the next case, Joe is more comfortable with the concept of taking risk, so he tries to establish that business of his dreams, but unfortunately, he fails in doing that and has to end up in the corporate world to be able to find and sustain his life. And in this case, he ends up saving $900,000. In our third case, Joe is successful in establishing that lifestyle business that he's always wanted, like that coffee shop or that yoga studio. And in this case, his savings by the time he's 65 is in fact $2.8 million. And in the fourth case, our last case, where Joe goes for an all-or-nothing approach, or sort of like the Elon Musk approach maybe, and disrupts an innovative technology, his net worth or his savings by the time he's 65 is in fact $8 million. Here's a graph that shows the 4 cases we just looked at. The main takeaway from this analysis is that even in the worst case, if Joe fails at exploration and ultimately ends up wasting the 5 years of his life, his downside in terms of his savings by the time he's 65 is 35%. But if he's able to establish that lifestyle business that he's always wanted, something with more guaranteed cash flows, like that coffee shop, his upside is 100%. Or basically, he's able to save up twice the money that he was by just working a corporate job. In our last case, if Joe is successful with innovating a disruptive technology and he gets a successful early exit, his upside is 500%. The best investors in the world today look at the downside versus the upside an opportunity brings to them. I just proved to you that taking 5 years of Joe's life to explore his non-feasible goals was in fact worth it because it brought limited downside but significant upside just from a monetary perspective. Obviously, this analysis did not take into account intangibles such as increased self-worth and recognition that Joe would get by pursuing his passion. And while this analysis focused on a 22-year-old just graduating from university, the takeaways from this analysis apply to you no matter what stage of life you are at. Not taking the risks in life to get to what you really want is in fact the most impractical thing you can do. If practicality is about minimizing your losses and maximizing your returns, you will most do that when you try out that 2, 3, or 10 different things that you want to try out. People are actually taking the biggest risks in their life when they continue doing something they don't completely enjoy. They're taking the risks of not fulfilling their dreams and ultimately having a sense of dissatisfaction towards the end of their lives. Live the life that you want to live, not the life society wants you to live. In conclusion, don't let practicality limit your dreams. Try for that dream job, go for that political role, or try to establish that business of your dreams, because the downside is limited, but the upside is unlimited. Dream big and start to get there through small, practical steps. Be practical in your actions, not your ambitions. As I stand here in the City of Champions, I'd like to end my talk with the wise words of Mr. Wayne Gretzky. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Thank you.